Yes, exactly as Joe said. The resurrection is what distinguishes our faith from every other faith and every other worldview in human history. And it also kind of signifies the reality that, unlike most other worldviews, our faith is anchored in a historical event, a verifiable, testable historical event. Like I said about the Bible more generally, all the more is the case for the resurrection. And so there are a lot of apologists, people that do the kind of work that Dr. Wong and I do, and evangelists. And in terms of answering questions about God and science, God and the Old Testament, seeming contradictions in the Bible, all of these other things that the Christian has to overcome to explain and to establish the credibility of their faith, a lot of apologists and evangelists, they just go straight to the resurrection. Because while all of the other questions are important, and we'll continue to talk about them, and we'll answer many more of your questions in the Q&A forum this afternoon, if we can establish the credibility of the evidence for the resurrection, that's it. That's the ball game. Nothing else really matters. We can have all the debates we want about Genesis, all the debates we want about Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls, all the debates we want about Christians being hypocrites and churches doing this, that, and the other. But if the resurrection happened, then that's the whole ball game. That's the Christian faith entrenched and locked in truth, in reality, through evidence. So this is a hugely important topic for anyone who's walking with Jesus, who wants to be able to share and defend their faith and wants people who don't know him to experience his love and experience the fellowship that we all have. Now again, for some people, this is not an issue. You know, for some people who don't know Jesus, their position, it's actually quite a sensible position, is, look, if God is real and this Jesus is who you said he was, then I have, full confidence that he could have been crucified and risen from the dead. That's actually not a big deal for an all-powerful God that created the whole universe. But for some people, this is the ball game. I know certainly friends of mine in Australia who have said, everything about your faith and this whole Christian thing I like, but I just can't believe that someone rose from the dead. I just can't believe someone would rise from the dead. And they're speaking, and you guys know this, most of you are in the medical profession, or you're going to be. They say this not because they're just being difficult, but they say it from a pretty strong statistical body of evidence, whereby in their life and in their experience, people who die stay dead. I'm not a doctor, and I know that. Generally speaking, when people die, they stay dead. That's what the evidence shows, that's what the medicine shows, that's what the science shows, that's what our history tells us, that's what our experience shows. When people die, they stay dead. So if you're going to try and establish a worldview and establish a faith in a person who claimed to be God and rose from the dead, you're going to have to bring some pretty compelling evidence. So where is this evidence for the resurrection? What is the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Like I said, in my view, if this session is successful, if people can accept what I'm about to say, then that's the end of the story. All other questions are just window dressing. They're still important, but if we can establish this, then the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ is established once and for all. And then everything else is just arguing about details. So the first point I would make is to refer you to the first session, to the credibility of the Bible. So everything I talked about in terms of establishing the credibility of the Bible, right? The prophecy, the peer review, the parchments and the papyruses, the people, the name recognition, all of that stuff, that all goes to this, because in that document, the resurrection is the central feature of the Bible. So the credibility of the Bible, at least in some part, speaks to the historical, evidential credibility of the resurrection itself. So that's the first point. The first point is the last 45 minutes. Okay? That actually does help to build a foundation. But I'll be the first to admit that it's not enough. Certainly as a lawyer, it's not enough. As a non-Christian, for me, it wasn't enough. And even as a Christian, for me, I was always looking for more. So let's look more specifically at what the actual evidence is for the resurrection. I want to talk about it in three categories. The first is I want to talk about burdens of proof. Secondly, I want to talk about the possibility of improbabilities. The possibility of improbabilities. And thirdly, I want to talk about an approach that is used in apologetics when we talk about the resurrection called the minimal facts approach. The minimal facts approach. This will all become clearer as we go. So, firstly, burdens of proof. Secondly, the possibility of improbabilities. And thirdly and finally, the minimal facts approach. So the first thing is burdens of proof. Now, as a lawyer, burdens of proof is a very normal, rational, easy concept to understand. I know for normal people who are not lawyers, it needs a bit of fleshing out. But basically, when you're in a courtroom, whether it's criminal law or civil law, whether you're suing someone or defending yourself against an allegation of a crime that supposedly you have committed, there are, generally speaking, two burdens of proof that the legal system puts in place. One is the balance of probabilities, right? In the civil law, in the law where, there are motor vehicle accidents, or when people are suing each other, when companies go to court, when Apple and Samsung just keep suing each other back and forth every 10 minutes for copying screens and copying apps and copying designs and so forth, the whole burden of proof is the balance of probabilities. What's more likely to have happened? That's what I was talking about during the Q&A in the previous session when I talked about inductive reasoning. Is it more likely that Jesus rose from the dead or not? The burden of proof, the balance of probabilities. The other legal standard is beyond reasonable doubt. Beyond reasonable doubt is a much higher standard, and it's usually used, certainly in the British Roman legal systems and in countries like Malaysia, Australia and so forth, it's used for criminal cases. Because when you're trying someone for something serious, like murder or rape, then you want to know that they did it beyond reasonable doubt. We don't want to be locking up innocent people. So beyond reasonable doubt is a much higher threshold. Now, personally, in my view, I believe that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ covers the burden of beyond reasonable doubt. I think it actually reaches that standard. As a lawyer and as a Christian, I think it reaches the standard of beyond reasonable doubt. But what's important to remember is that in history, amongst historical scholars and history professors and historical experts globally, not just Christians, everyone, their threshold for establishing historical facts is the balance of probabilities. So the threshold that historians used when they tell us things that happened, things about Alexander the Great, things about Leonardo da Vinci, things about world wars, things about empires, things about climate cycles, anything that happened in the past, before it can be accepted as historical knowledge and historical fact, it has to be proven on the balance of probabilities. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a historical event. So if we want to meet the standard of the rest of the world's historical evidential standards, we need to be able to establish it on the balance of probabilities, not beyond reasonable doubt. Don't let anyone argue you into saying, oh, you guys are claiming something so ridiculous, you need to be able to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. Well, I think we can anyway, but I would still reject the premise of the question. And I would say, well, there's all kinds of ridiculous things that happen throughout history, and they're all proved on the balance of probabilities, and now they're accepted as historical fact. So it should be with the resurrection. The burden of proof, the standard of proof that we have as believers to establish the historical credibility of the resurrection is the balance of probabilities. Is it more likely to have happened or not? So that's the first thing. That's the standard of proof, the balance of probabilities. That's what we're working for here. I think we actually get much higher than that, but let's go with that. Secondly, what about the possibility of improbabilities? There's a philosopher called David Hume, who's a very influential philosopher from Scotland who spoke a lot about why miracles are not possible. And he basically said, in a very circular way, the reason miracles can't happen is because they are impossible. And when asked, well, how do you test for the possibility of miracles? What about when you have evidence, eyewitness evidence or experiential evidence for miracles actually having happened? How do you test that? And he says, well, the evidence that you have is much, much more likely to have been fabricated or to be fake because miracles are impossible. So because they're not possible, it's very unlikely that the evidence is legitimate. So they're impossible. So Hume's argument actually boils down to saying miracles are impossible because they are not possible, which is not an argument. It's circular logic, it's circular reasoning. And he has been highly criticized by other academics throughout history. Because of his stature, he was like one of the Einsteins of inductive philosophy of his time. But on this particular issue, he's been severely criticized by Christian and non-Christian thinkers for the last X hundred years because of this. So when we think about the possibility of improbabilities, the first thing we can accept when it comes to the resurrection is that yes, it is intrinsically highly, highly improbable. It's improbable that people rise from the dead after they are dead. They've been killed, they're pronounced dead. Can they rise from the dead? Highly, highly improbable. That doesn't mean necessarily that it is impossible. Now, in the law, we make way for this in the law. And I'm sorry, I'm talking to a bunch of doctors in legal terms, but I'm a lawyer, so at least I talk about what I can understand. So hopefully it'll make some sense to you. But in the law, the entire legal system is about giving the possibility of improbabilities to be proven. Because if things were always just what we assumed they would be, based on history, based on what we think would happen, based on what has happened in the past, then you would never need to go to court for anything. Because what it seemed to be would always be what the decision of the court was. But the reason we have the law is because all of the evidence might say something, but we need to go in deeper to actually find out the truth of what happened, even if the truth was highly, highly improbable. So the whole point of having a legal system, having a judicial system, having investigations, and looking and scrutinizing evidence is because we understand that improbable things are technically possible sometimes. They're very unlikely, they're very rare, but improbable doesn't mean impossible. There is a possibility of some improbable things to happen. So conceptually, the possibility of the resurrection needs to be put into that framework. Now let's say I was walking down whatever the main street is in downtown KL. What's one of the big streets in downtown KL, Dr. Wong? Okay, whatever he just said. Jalata. Let's say I'm driving to meet Dr. Wong, and I'm driving down Jalata in my taxi, and I see a gorilla running across the road. Right? It's 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, I see a gorilla running across the road. Very, very improbable. Very impossible, many would say. Gorillas don't occur in downtown KL naturally. It's not their national habitat. They're just not going to be there. So I get to work, and I meet with Dr. Wong, and I say to him, hey, I just saw a gorilla in the middle of the street in Jalata. He was just like in the middle of the street. And Dr. Wong, being a medical professional and also being a nice man and a rational one, he just assumes that I've gone crazy. That either I had a few too many drinks that morning, or that I just missaw because I'm jet lagged from the flight, or that where I come from I have a very different definition of the word gorilla to what he has. And maybe where I come from in Sri Lanka we refer to policemen as gorillas, or something like that. Anyway, he tries to explain it away, right? He tries to explain it logically, based on his understanding of what's improbable and what's probable. Because it's just improbable, highly, highly improbable that I'd see a gorilla walking across Jalata in KL on a Monday morning. Later in the day, other news... So I report that I've seen this gorilla because I'm certain of it, even if Dr. Wong doesn't believe me, I'm certain of it. So I report this to one of the news stations. Later in the day, other news stations pick up the story. And they say that they've been getting reports from lots of other people who were travelling into work that day that they saw a gorilla walking down the middle of this street in downtown KL. Lots and lots of people start to report it. Still doesn't make it true. Still could be a whole lot of crazy people, deluded people. But suddenly, the body of evidence starts to build. Then, let's say, in the afternoon, the KL Zoo puts out a statement saying, we are so excited to welcome our 2 new gorillas to the gorilla exhibit at KL Zoo that flew in from Northern Africa this morning. But we regret to inform that by the time they went from KL Airport to the actual zoo, when they got to the zoo, the cage that they were travelling in on the back of the truck was open, and only 1 gorilla was inside. Right? We know they went through the CBD. We know there were 2 gorillas at the beginning in the airport. We know that the zoo had ordered these gorillas, so we know that they're in the city, and now we know that there's only 1 of them that made it to the zoo. It still doesn't prove that I saw a gorilla, does it? It still doesn't prove deductively what I saw. But the body of inductive evidence that is starting to now build around this intrinsic improbability starts to become very, very strong. I'm now not looking as crazy as I first looked when I say there's a gorilla. Suddenly we're starting to think, actually, the most rational explanation of all of the evidence that we have, all the surrounding evidence when we take it into account, the most reasonable way of understanding that evidence is to conclude that there actually was a gorilla in the middle of Jalata that morning. That is actually the most reasonable thing. Because what was originally an intrinsic improbability, because of highly compelling surrounding evidence, has become not just possible, but quite highly probable. And this is the important principle to take from this second heading of the possibility of improbabilities. Deep intrinsic improbabilities, like miracles, like resurrections, they can be reversed as improbabilities with very compelling surrounding evidence. So it is in the legal system. All possibilities, even highly improbable ones, can be proven and accepted with very high levels of surrounding evidence. If you can build a strong case around it, improbabilities suddenly start to look possible And if you keep building, the evidence suddenly start to look very highly probable. And you can keep building, and it can get almost to the point where anything other than that conclusion starts to seem impossible. Whereas this is the most rational, the most logical, however improbable it actually seemed like. So it is with the resurrection of Jesus. So let's look then, thirdly and finally, at the minimal facts theory. The minimal facts approach is an approach taken by two academics called Mike Licona and Gary Habermas. They wrote a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it's a very well-written book. It's obviously great for believers to get equipped and to kind of summarize some of what I'm saying. But it's also a great book for non-believers because it's written very much using historical inquiry, the principles of non-Christian academic scholarship and evidence and data gathering and the principles of probability. So the case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what they basically start off with is they say, let's look at all of the academic scholarship, all the historical evidence, all of what the experts actually agree on that happened around the life of Jesus Christ. What does everyone agree on that happened? What are the minimal facts that everyone agrees on? This is actually what we do in court. It's what parents do when two of their kids are fighting and they're trying to get the full story. They say, all right, what can we agree on here? What can we agree actually happened? So what these guys did was they got, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 of the top, most peer-reviewed academic articles from historians, from ancient historians and biblical scholars, both Christians and non-Christians. And they said, what can we all agree on around the life, death, alleged resurrection of Jesus Christ? And there were 6 minimal facts that everyone agreed on, Christian and non-Christian. 6 minimal facts. I'm only going to talk about 3 of them this morning, partially because of time and partially because I think you only need 3 to close the deal, to close the case. So I'm just going to talk about 3. But there are 3 more if you want to check the book or Google it later. The 3 most powerful, in my view, minimal facts that all peer-reviewed and credible historians agreed on was that Jesus Christ lived and was crucified by the Roman Empire and that he died as a result. Jesus Christ was crucified by the Roman Empire and died. Second minimal fact, actually no, I'm sorry. Let me just amend that slightly and I'll come back to it. The first minimal fact is that Jesus Christ was crucified by the Roman Empire. He was crucified by the Roman Empire. There's sufficient evidence for that. The second one is that his disciples, those close to him, and a number of other people in and around Jerusalem at the time genuinely believed that he rose from the dead 3 days after he was crucified. That's the second fact. Many people around him, those close to him, those that even didn't know him, believed that he rose from the dead 3 days after that. And third minimal fact, his followers, the early Christian church, grew exponentially for the subsequent 450 years, 350 or 450 years, grew exponentially. So Jesus was crucified. Many people at that time, eyewitnesses, believed that he rose from the dead. And his following, the early church, grew exponentially in the subsequent X hundred years. All 3 minimal facts don't prove the resurrection, right? They don't prove the resurrection deductively, as I was saying. But they're pretty powerful because they are accepted as historical fact. It's accepted as historical fact that he was crucified. It's accepted that the people genuinely believed that he had risen from the dead. And it's accepted that his church grew and continues to grow. It's one of the reasons that we're all still here. So we're actually part of the third minimal fact, right? So now the question becomes this, and this is how it works in a courtroom. Once you've established the minimal facts that everyone agrees on, now we have to look at whose definition of the truth, whose story of the truth best fits those minimal facts. So we know that these are agreed upon by all sides. So the question is, what is the best explanation of these minimal facts? The fact that he was crucified, that everyone thought that he rose again, and that his church grew. What makes best sense of that? We know what our position is, the biblical position. What the eyewitness accounts in the Gospels tell us is that he actually did rise from the dead. He actually was resurrected. Right? So that's one version of the truth. That's the Christian understanding of the truth. That's the version I believe to be true. But if we're going to do this properly, we have to look at what are the alternative versions. What are the other possible explanations of this intrinsic improbability? Because the resurrection, the fact that he rose from the dead, fits perfectly all of the minimal facts. But there might be something else that fits it better. And because resurrection as a concept is highly improbable, we have to be reasonable in considering all of these other possibilities. And there have been 3 theories that have been put forward by either non-Christians or anti-Christians or scholars who are trying to disprove the resurrection. I'm going to go through all 3 of them with you. And so the only way we will know the strength of the evidence for the resurrection is if we first look at and scrutinize and see how well these other 3 theories hold up. So the first theory is the deception theory. And the deception theory is that these disciples and the other eyewitnesses that were referred to in the Gospels, that they conspired. The whole thing was a conspiracy, and they made it all up. They just pretended that he had rose from the dead, that he had risen. They stole the body, and they pretended that he had risen from the dead. So it's a deception theory, a theory that the whole thing was a deception. And that's why people thought that he had risen from the dead. So the crucifixion, correct. He died, correct. People thought he rose from the dead, correct. And the church grew, correct. But it all happened because the disciples faked it. They faked the whole thing. Now here are the problems with this theory. Here are the big problems with the deception theory. The first problem is, all that would have to happen, this is just a group of a handful of fishermen, right? A handful of fishermen and a handful of women who are followers of Jesus, engaged in this conspiracy. All the authorities would have had to do, and when I say authorities, I mean not just the Jewish authorities and the entire temple establishment and the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and all the people that were responsible for the crucifixion, but the entire force of the Roman Empire as well. All they would all have had to do is produce the body. All they would have had to do is produce the body. Show the body of Jesus, and that disproves the resurrection straight away. That shows that it was a deception. That upholds the deception theory. That's all they would have had to do. And yet still, to this very day, no one can produce it. Meanwhile, we have bones of kings and princes and princesses and emperors and empresses and pharaohs from long before Jesus that you can carbon date and DNA test and so forth. But no one's able to produce the body of Jesus. And it was very much in the interests of the Roman Empire and the Jewish establishment to disprove this resurrection. They could have just gotten rid of it very quickly. All they had to do is produce the body. Find it, produce it. Kidnap all of these people, force them to show them where they'd hidden it, or take it themselves and just present it to the people and say, this is the end of it. And that would have been the end of it. And that didn't happen. So deception is unlikely in that regard. The second, and I think more powerful point, that is actually quite a powerful point, but the one that's more powerful is that all of these disciples, all of these so-called conspirators that made up the idea of the resurrection, they didn't just spend the rest of their lives traveling, sharing the good news of Jesus and being evangelists all over the world. They did so at great danger to themselves, with great suffering, and almost all of them ended up dying for what they were preaching, dying for what they believed. Peter was crucified upside down. Bartholomew, the disciple Bartholomew, he was skinned alive for what he believed. Now, there's lots of examples throughout history of people dying for a lie. There's lots of things you can die for that is not true. But what we don't have any evidence of is people dying for something they know to be a lie. And that's what the deception theory actually posits. It's saying not only were these guys faking it, they were willing to go and die for something that they knew was not true. Now, if these guys were such expert manipulators and expert frauds that were able to conspire to invent this myth, just to, I don't know, get more famous or to start a new church, surely at the moment of execution, the moment of torture, the moment of crucifixion, the moment of when they were about to be killed themselves, surely they would have just flipped and said, okay, yeah, we made it up. But no, they actually all went on and died for what they believed to be true. It's very unlikely that they were deceiving people and died for something they knew to be a lie. It's very easy to die for something that you think is true. But to die for something that you know to be a lie, there's no evidence of that. The psychiatrists will tell you that that's completely illogical and nonsensical. If you know something is a lie, you actively and consciously know it, and then you lie. You know, in the Watergate scandal with Richard Nixon, one of the conspirators, very senior guy in the White House, one of his senior advisors, who was behind the entire Watergate bugging of the opposition party's offices, right? So they planted microphones in the office headquarters of the opposing political party, and that happened in the Watergate Hotel. That's why now whenever there's any kind of conspiracy, they put gate at the end of it. That's why. I know you guys had handbag gate here a couple of weeks ago, right? So that's from Watergate. Anyway, one of these senior advisors of Nixon, who was clearly a messed up guy, he went to jail because of Watergate. And he When all of these guys were interrogated by police and were given deals and were told that, look, we know what you've done, we have evidence of what you guys did, you need to testify against the president, you need to testify against each other, and we'll give you a lesser court sentence, they all rolled over. They all took deals. And this guy, he took a deal, he went to jail. In jail, he found Jesus. And he became a Christian, and he started investigating the evidence for the resurrection. And when he came out, they said, what was it that did it for you, finally, that convinced you of the resurrection? He said, we were 15 of the most intelligent political and security operatives in the world, and we couldn't keep secret hiding a handful of microphones in a hotel for more than 3 months. And you're willing to tell me that 12 fishermen, who even come across as idiots in their own gospels that they wrote themselves, you're telling me that 12 fishermen from ancient Palestine them and their followers could keep a secret for 2,000 years? That's at the magnitude of someone rising from the dead. He said it's not possible. Human intelligence doesn't rise to that level of conspiracy. People can't keep a secret for that long, and they're certainly not willing to die for it. These guys were willing to just roll over on their boss. They weren't even willing to carry the deception for an extra couple of years in jail. They just turned on each other straight away. He said, that's when I knew. That's when I knew this resurrection was real. So the deception theory is comfortably disproven and undermined by in a number of different ways. So then people go to the second anti-resurrection theory, which is delusion. They say, okay, maybe these guys weren't conspiring. Maybe they weren't in it together. Maybe they actually believed that he rose from the dead, but he didn't actually rise from the dead. Maybe that's why they went and died for it, because they were deluded. And that's fair. That's actually a logical position. So the question then is, how reasonable, how evidence-based is the delusion theory? Well, you guys are doctors. You will probably know this. If there are psychiatrists in the room, you will definitely know this. Delusion is definitely possible, and certainly soon after someone you love dies, them turning up in a dream or even turning up in in an apparition or in an imaginary context in front of you is not unusual at all. But there is no medical evidence or cognitive evidence of group delusion, right? Even if 7 of us got together and just like dropped acid or popped a few ecstasy pills or had 15 shots of tequila, we might all have delusions, but they would all be very, very different. What the accounts of the Gospels tell us is that if it was a delusion, all of these people deluded the exact same thing about the exact same person, having the exact same conversations in the exact same places. Group delusion is deeply, deeply unlikely. There's no medical evidence of it even being possible. There's no neurological or cognitive evidence of it ever having happened. And so the idea that every time Jesus appeared to the disciples, that they were all simultaneously imagining the same Jesus saying the same things, that they were simultaneously imagining him on the beach, eating fish that they just barbecued together, all purely by chance and purely by delusion, is medically deeply, deeply unlikely. Group delusion just simply doesn't happen. And the other thing, finally, even if we don't want to accept that for the 12, if you can somehow get your head around the possibility that by coincidence 12 people who were in their right mind had a group delusion somehow, 1 Corinthians 15:3, that creed I was talking about in the first session, that says 500 people saw him. 500 people saw the resurrected Christ, and many of them are still around. Go and ask them. That's what Paul writes in that creed. That's the creed that was dated to within 18 months of the resurrection. So now you have to convince us that 500 people can have a group delusion. 500 people having an identical group delusion. Very, very, very unlikely. Very, very improbable. So deception theory fails. Delusion theory fails. The third and the final theory is the swoon theory. The swoon theory is the theory that Jesus never actually died. Sure, he was crucified, but he was still alive when they took him down. And so, yes, he was in the tomb for 3 days, and the story is all correct. When they came back to look for him, they found him alive because he recovered. He was resting in the tomb. He recovered from the worst of his wounds. And that's why they could fake the resurrection. He was walking around. Then it was the real Jesus. It wasn't deluded. It wasn't a delusion. It wasn't a deception. He was alive. But it's because he never actually died. That's the swoon theory. A number of big problems with the swoon theory as well. We've seen the delusion theory and the deception theory comprehensively dismantled. The swoon theory, the primary problem is the nature of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire in human history was responsible for inventing and pioneering the form of execution that we know as crucifixion. So these guys came up with it, right? And the idea was to maximize pain and humiliation, and to publicize the death of the person, partially as a punishment, but more importantly as a deterrent to other people, to show the power of the empire. If you mess around with us, if you mess around with our political empire and the strength of our establishment, this is what's going to happen to you. And we know from other evidence, extrinsic writing and history of the Roman Empire, that the soldiers that were commissioned to carry out crucifixions had very clear contracts and KPIs that were built in to their jobs and into their missions. And the most powerful thing to know, the most important thing in this context to know, is that if there were Roman soldiers that were responsible for a crucifixion, like the crucifixion of Jesus, and the subject of the crucifixion did not die, if they failed in their crucifixion, they failed to ensure that he was dead, then they and their families would be crucified, tortured and crucified. The soldiers would be tortured and crucified by the empire, at the order of the emperor. So they built in structurally huge incentives for these guys to make sure that they got it right. And we have all kinds of historical evidence of crucifixions throughout the Roman Empire over hundreds of years of the empire. And in not one occasion do you find a failed crucifixion, because they just weren't possible, because there was so much at stake for the soldiers. And you can understand that from the empire perspective. There were other empires threatening from the east and so forth. So they wanted to really cement their authority. So from a political perspective, it's very unlikely that the soldiers would be so incompetent or lazy or careless as to miss the fact that this crucified body was actually still a living person. So in a political sense, the swoon theory is very difficult to uphold. Secondly, and briefly, because you guys would all know this, in a medical sense, it's very difficult to account for. Just the lacerations on Jesus' back from when he was tortured, many of you would know, are enough to result in death. The asphyxiation, enough to result in death. The fact that the historical record shows that they broke the legs of the other two people who were crucified, but when they came to break Jesus' legs, they saw that he was already dead, and then they pierced his side with a spear, just to make sure. That's because of the rule. That's because of the rule that if they mess up the crucifixion, they're going to be crucified. That's why they pierced the side. Otherwise, why would you bother to be so sure? They pierced the side, and what came out? Water. Blood and water. And I don't know the name of this term. You will all know the name of this term. But when someone dies, something happens to your blood. You stop bleeding, is that right? It coagulates or something. Some fancy medical term, probably Latin, with a Latin origin or something. But what I know is, from what I have read, that when you pierce the side of a dead body and blood and water comes out, that's exactly what you would expect of a dead body. You wouldn't expect it of a living body or a living person. Right? And that phenomena that you guys all know as doctors and medical professionals, or soon-to-be medical professionals, that wasn't known back then. That's just someone writing an eyewitness account of what they saw coming out of Jesus. That wasn't a doctor trying to conspire there to help with this fraud or anything like that. They're just saying he was dead, and then they pierced him, and then this came out, and that's the end of it. But from that we can see quite clearly that it's very likely, very, very likely, almost certain that he was in fact dead. He wasn't faking it. A couple of other points, and I'm living proof that you don't need to be a doctor to follow these arguments, but given what he had been through, let's say all of that was incorrect and what I'd said wasn't believable or wasn't enough for you, and he was actually still alive somehow. Then he was placed in the tomb. For him to be in the tomb for 3 days with no medical attention, with nothing at all, with no drip, with no ICU, with no specialists, with nothing, without food, without water, with everything that he had been through, all of that asphyxiation, all of the lacerating, the spear in the side, for 3 days, and then 3 days later to be walking around, seemingly completely healed, completely cogent, completely rational in his right mind, physically being able to walk everywhere. That seems very, very unlikely, let alone to have him soon after that sitting on a beach eating barbecued fish with his friends. The kicker for me is actually the Luke account of the walk to Emmaus. When Jesus is walking with two of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, if somehow he had survived his own crucifixion and the spear to the side and the asphyxiation and all of these things and the torture, on what medical basis is someone that's been through all of that likely within a few days of that to be walking what's likely to have been 4 or 5 kilometers with two of his friends on the road to Emmaus and walking normally? Surely, if he was hobbling along or in whatever the equivalent of a wheelchair or a wheelbarrow was at the time, that would have made it into the account. But they said very clearly in Luke's account And Luke's a historian. He's a doctor, so we can trust him, right? They say very clearly that he walked with them. The whole road to Emmaus, he was just walking. So the swoon theory just falls over on so many different levels. So when we look at the possibility that it was all a big deception, it's so very unlikely. It's so very unlikely. When we look at the possibility that it was all a big delusion, it's so very unlikely. And we look at the possibility that he didn't actually die, it's so very unlikely. These things are highly, highly improbable. So what we're left with is the possibility that suddenly becomes quite a probability that he actually rose from the dead. He actually rose in the way that the eyewitness accounts depict him to have risen. And if he did, then the exponential growth of the church after that is perfectly understandable and perfectly explained. Otherwise, you're left with 12 fishermen, or 12 guys, most of whom who were fishermen, all from the, generally speaking, the lowest rungs of society, and some crazy rabbi who all sparked off a religious movement that completely took over the world over the subsequent 1,000, 2,000 years. And you have no other way of explaining that if he didn't rise from the dead. If he didn't rise from the dead, you somehow have to explain that these 13 guys got together and somehow turned the world upside down. There were generals and empires and kings and queens that were trying to turn the world upside down, even with their enormous armies, had not even a speck of the influence that the person of Jesus Christ had. On human politics, on human economics, on human cultures, on human movements, on human thinking, on philosophy, on all of the disciplines we know. The medical profession, every profession, so influenced deeply and structurally by this one person. It makes no sense as to how that could even happen so quickly unless he actually did rise from the dead. Unless he actually did rise from the dead. One of my professors in Oxford is a guy called Richard Swinburne. He's a philosopher of religion. And he actually took all of this evidence for the resurrection and all of the counter theories, deception, delusion, swoon, and a couple of others that were much weaker. And anyway, and then he took all of the historical facts and the stuff that Habermas and Licona had been talking about, and he used Bayes' mathematical theorem. Some of you have studied maths or probability. I'm sure you studied some maths or stats early on in medicine or in dentistry. That's the reason why I studied law, actually. But Bayes is basically it's the main tool we use to calculate probability. You know, a lot of the people in finance use it. They use it for financial models and economic models and so forth. The engineers use it a lot. It's how you calculate the probability of something given a number of other things that you know. So given that it's very cloudy today, that it hasn't rained for 10 days, that the average rainfall in Kuching is this much, that it's this month, what's the probability of it raining today? So it's probability analysis, probability theory. And Professor Swinburne did Bayes' probability analysis on the resurrection of Jesus Christ, using all of the accepted historical evidence from Christians and non-Christians. And of course it's very difficult to put these sorts of facts and pieces of evidence into mathematical quantities. So he did some approximating, and he came up with some possibilities, the possibility of God not existing versus the possibility of God existing. And he was reasonably balanced. You can look through his appendix of his book, which he actually fleshes out how he did his calculations. And no peer review has ever tried to rebut or undermine his calculations or his findings. And he found, using Bayes' probability analysis, that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is 97% probable, based on the evidence that he found. 101 over 103. 97%. He's a professor of Oxford University, probably the most influential English-speaking philosophy of religion professor in the world today. He's about 300 years old now, I think. He probably has the same diet that Mahathir has. But he's still teaching, an amazing guy. His book is called The Resurrection of God Incarnate, if you're interested. The book is kind of dense and difficult to read, but the appendix is fascinating because it has the mathematical equations for what he did. And he's the first to admit that these are just approximations and these are taking non-mathematical concepts and putting them into a mathematical theory. But the reasoning is sound. And the bottom line is not the 97%. The bottom line is it's a very, very high probability. The inductive evidence, the inductive reasoning, and the logic behind it all, and the evidential scrutiny of everything that we see leads to a very natural, sensible, reasonable conclusion that Jesus Christ did in fact rise from the dead, that he was in fact exactly whom he said he was. God himself came into the world as a person, died for our sins, and rose from the dead. The question for your friends and your colleagues and your family members that don't know him, when you share aspects of this topic and this evidence with them, is that it's not enough to just end with that verdict, because the verdict then demands a response. The verdict demands a response. It's not just a fun fact or a useful thing to know, because the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, once it's established, as we can establish it, as I've shown just a little bit of the evidence for, everyone that hears that, everyone that comes into contact with this message, has an obligation to either accept it and step into that relationship, or to reject it and fly in the face of all of that evidence. So I encourage you to be clear with people, in a loving way, in a relational way, yes, but also in a very honest way, especially with intellectually minded people who are looking for evidence and looking for reasoning. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is far more compelling than I ever thought it would be, even as a believer. I'd been a believer for about 10 years before I came across this stuff, and it just completely blew my mind. It's really, really solid. And it's all targeted. Everything I've said this morning, both sessions, but this session specifically, is targeted at the skeptic or the non-believer. You need no faith to understand this reasoning. You need no pre-existing commitment to Christianity. You don't even have to like Christianity to look at this reasoning and this logic. This is pure, logical, evidential reasoning that, God willing, will help you guys bring people to the feet of Jesus. I'd love for it to do two things: to help you bring people to the feet of Jesus, and also to affirm and encourage you in your faith. That this person that you've been journeying with is not a figment of your imagination. He's real. He actually lived as a person and died and literally, bodily rose from the dead 3 days later. We have the evidence for it. We have the evidence for it. You don't need the evidence to be journeying with him and walking with him through relationship, but I hope the evidence helps and strengthens you and encourages you in your faith. I'm just going to pray quickly, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions, I think. Heavenly Father, we just commit these 2 morning sessions into your hands. I thank you again for my brothers and sisters who are here this morning. I pray that everything I've said, all of the evidence that you have shown us, all of the reasoning, all of the logic, all of the proofs, while they are not everything, Lord, because we know a relationship with you begins with the heart, often these things are needed when we share with our friends, when we're answering questions. And so we pray that for those in our lives who don't know you, for those amongst them for whom the entry point is a questioning of the evidence, a questioning of the reliability of the Bible, a questioning of how we can even be open to the possibility of the resurrection. For those people, I pray that this material and some of these points that I've made would be useful. I pray that you would increase and that I have decreased in the hearts and minds of each of us here. And I pray that this would all be edifying and affirming for all of my brothers and sisters in the room, and that they would go from these 2 sessions encouraged and confident in serving a God of evidence, a God of wonder, a God of love, a God that came for us and died for us in human history and rose from the dead in human history, proving who he was. Let us now go forward, Lord, and stand firm in that proof and in that fact and in that truth of who your Son, Jesus Christ, was and is in our lives today. In his name, amen.